Hello. Thank you today for joining us. Welcome. I know some people are still joining us and on their way. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the launch of the State of Civil Society report. We are so excited to be having this session today, and we're so excited to finally have this report out. Thank you to everybody, all my colleagues on the call, and everybody that has contributed immensely. And of course, to you members that have contributed to getting us to the finish line and also having this report live. So I have here my colleagues online. We have 1 hour, 30 minutes. We don't have all day, and it's going to be a very interesting conversation. So I'm going to probably skip individual introductions, and we're just going to get right into it. Of course, I'm your facilitator for today. My name is Ifnaya Oyaone. I'm based in Nigeria. I'm a Nigerian, and I work with the membership engagement team. So I'm going to be passing to, and of course, we'll have my colleagues from different clusters here as well in attendance. We have our Secretary General, Mandip, on the call. And then I'm just going to get us right into it, and I'll be passing to Victoria to kick us up. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Happy to have you here on the call. Thank you everyone for being part of this webinar. So just a few notes. This report is coming out tomorrow on the 12th. So this is just an exclusive preview for you as you are members of Civicus. We will have the chat enabled throughout all the calls. So please feel free to ask any questions and we will try to forward them to the panelists once the webinar is done. There's no much to say apart from that. This meeting is going to be recorded, but don't stress, we're not recording you. And once it's over, you will be able to watch the recording again. Now, Mandip, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you, Fernanda. Hello, dear members. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And our membership and networks team was very keen to have this exclusive preview of the State of Civil Society report with yourselves first before we launch it to the world. And very pleased to be here to be able to share this with all of you. And it's great to see that we have already 160 people on the call. So it's heartening to know that there is so much interest in our State of Civil Society report. Nanya, I will ask you to help me run the presentation, but maybe we can just go back to the first slide, to the slide before, and I can just say next when we move. The State of Civil Society report, as you all know, it's our flagship report. We have been producing this report since 2011. So this is the 15th iteration of our State of Civil Society report. It's a report about the health and conditions of civil society around the world. It's a report on global events and how we interpret them from a civil society perspective. It's how we responded as civil society to what's going on around the world. And it, of course, looks at events over the previous year, but also events that are happening at present, and it has some reflections for the coming year. That's how we framed this report. In producing this report, we interviewed over 250 civil society practitioners, activists, people who are leading struggles for justice, equality, environmental sustainability, and importantly, peace around the world. It also draws on 100 articles from our rolling analysis initiative, Civicus Lens. So you will probably find a lot of resonance. Some of the material that you will see here will, of course, relate to some of the things that you may have read over the course of the year on Civicus Lens. So let me start here with sharing with you findings. We have 8 chapters in the State of Civil Society report this year, and we start with democracy. Democracy is really what, our quest for people to be able to exercise their agency to create better and more fairer societies is all about. And at Civicus, our work on civic freedoms, on civic participation, is closely interlinked with democracy. And as you would have all seen, the state of democracy at present is being deeply, deeply contested. Our findings from 2025 show that in many, many parts of the world, we are having a hardening of military regimes, military juntas. This is particularly prevalent in West Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and in other countries in the region. It's a huge challenge where military juntas are basically taking over governance under the under the guise of providing better facilities and services to people, and that remains a huge challenge because people lose their agency to shape the decisions that impact their lives. We've also seen sham elections in many parts of the world. Please, could we go back to the previous slide? Yes. We've also seen sham elections in many different parts of the world. We have seen sham elections in Uganda, in Cameroon, in Myanmar, in Tanzania, where incumbent governments have basically given the illusion of there being democracy, but have actually sought to reinforce their rule. And that's a huge challenge. We are also seeing that in some countries where there was some semblance of electoral democracy, there's been a slippery slope into authoritarianism through one party rule being consolidated. And this is the situation in countries like Turkey, in Tunisia, as well as El Salvador. So this remains a huge challenge. But in this moment, I would also say, as established democracies like the United States, as in many Western European countries, there is a resurgence of right-wing populist ethno-nationalist movements that are pushing an anti-rights discourse, and democratic frameworks are being weakened. Civil society action is still continuing. People are still continuing to come out onto the streets. There are plenty of upstanding people, as our findings show, who are really willing to fight for democracy, who are willing to fight for inclusive, substantive democracy in the global north, in the global south, in the majority world, and the minority world. So the struggle for democracy is continuing, and resistance is a key aspect of our theme throughout this year's report. That the struggles for resistance are there. It's shown in the idealism shown in civil society, in intergenerational movements, in young people's movements, in gender justice movements. So that remains alive and well, the spirit of resistance. Maybe move to the next slide, please. So, thank you. As connected with democracy, there are also issues with technology, and a major aspect of our report this year really is the alliance between tech oligarchs and the Trump administration in the United States. This is a very dangerous alliance. They are people who have managed to consolidate immense power and are merging technological forms of oppression and surveillance and other forms of control of society through technology to weaken civic space, to weaken democracy, to weaken civic participation, and that remains a huge, huge challenge. Civil society is still looking and pushing to ensure that there are guardrails for technology. As everyone is talking about AI and the benefits of artificial intelligence, there are also several dangers, and society is still not able to deal with these issues in a substantive manner, as the technology is far outstripping our ability to understand it, and that has very serious consequences in how conflicts are conducted, in how societies are governed, how democratic dissent is handled. So here, our work in civil society to highlight and expose corporate complicity in abuses is absolutely essential, while also building the guardrails to ensure that technology is able to work for the benefit of the people, not against them. We can move to the next slide, please. Uh, as you can see, with obviously technology is an area that global governance has still not been able to handle, but at the same time, our global governance institutions are facing an stress test. Powerful states are bypassing international law. There is a new mantra about might is right, about pragmatic realism, which tries to divorce itself from the values for behind which global institutions were established. And this remains a big challenge to the work that we have done in civil society over the past decades to promote human rights and social justice values. And it's absolutely critical at this point of time that we continue to reinforce the principles of international human rights law and humanitarian law that prevent attacks on civilians, that ensure protection of vulnerable populations in conflict, that ensure that the laws of war are properly observed, but also basic human rights principles like the right to peaceful protest, like the right against torture, like the right to form organizations to be able to criticize decision makers are respected, and global governance institutions are really critical in helping us do this. At the same time, we have powerful countries like the United States withdrawing from several global governance institutions, including the World Health Organization. Argentina followed suit on it. We have West African countries which are ruled by military juntas who have gotten themselves out of the economic community of West African states. We've also seen that there is organizing around G20 that is happening, which should ideally be within the rubric of the United Nations. So there are certain challenges, and I think at this time it's really also important for us to be able to support global governance institutions, especially as the UN is facing huge funding cuts, but at the same time critique them too, because global governance institutions are supposed to work for the people. And one part of the work that we are doing on this is Civicus's stewardship of the One for 8 Billion campaign, which is pushing for a transparent and open process for the appointment of the next Secretary General of the United Nations. We are pushing for the appointment of a feminist woman. The woman has never led the United Nations, despite women being more than half the population around the world. And also, we do want that the person who assumes the role should be able to lead with feminist leadership principles and human rights values. So that is some. So watch that space. That is something we are continuing to support. Next slide, please. Thank you. Uh, Obviously, if you read the news, if you see what's happening in current affairs with the invasion of Iran, with the invasion of Venezuela, if you're following events in Sudan, if you're following events in Myanmar, if you're following events in Gaza, the genocide and the continued occupation and usurpation of people's lands in the West Bank, conflict has become rampant. It's part of the might is right approach that is continuously being followed, and the breakdown of international law, including which a few years ago was precipitated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has sort of almost loosened the guardrails, and also the stigma around aggression by powerful states over smaller states, which we as civil society really need to push back against. So that is something that it remains a huge challenge. We are seeing that civilians are being targeted with callousness, and the calls for ending impunity by powerful people for commission of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Are being pushed by many people. So we really need to focus on ensuring that there needs to be accountability for these most serious crimes, and there can be no impunity in the name of political expedience being pushed by powerful states. So there is also a key finding from our report this year is that there is a proliferation of superficial peace deals, top-down peace deals, basically stitched up under the rubric of basically resource extraction. These are very superficial peace deals. As soon as they are signed, we find that the fighting continues. So there's a real need at this particular moment, and as and a gap that civil society needs to fill to make sure that there is bottom-up support for ensuring peace and social cohesion in our societies. Yet at the same time, despite all these challenges, we do see that civil society colleagues are stepping up to the plate. Many are involved in civil society negotiations for peace. Many are involved in providing humanitarian relief and support. But there are also civil society groups that are documenting war crimes, crimes against humanity in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, in the broader Middle East region, in Sudan, in Myanmar, as well as in Ukraine. So that work is still continuing. It's something that we are committed to supporting, even as conflicts are intensifying at the moment due to a paucity of visionary leadership on the international stage, due to paucity of moral leadership on the international stage. Next slide, please. Uh, the struggle for climate has gotten a setback due to the resurgence of the fossil fuel industry. This has been supported, of course, by the present U.S. administration, but it's also been something that we have been noticing through the organizing of COP meetings at petrostates, although the last one was in Brazil, which did make an effort to ensure inclusive voices, but there was still a heavy participation by fossil fuel industry to protect their interests, which means that our struggle for climate justice continues. As we know that climate issues tend to impact the most excluded people first, although they do affect everybody. And at this moment, the fossil fuel corporations and petrostates are feeling increasingly emboldened and are pushing for their own agenda, which oftentimes comes up to attack civil society and environmental activists, land rights activists, indigenous peoples' rights activists, anti-corruption activists, uh, and democracy activists are oftentimes at the in the firing line of the fossil fuel industry, which is acting in collusion with very powerful people and has been able to take over states. So, along with the tech industry, the fossil fuel industry presents a huge challenge to the world as we know it. We have, as civil society, been able to establish some legal victories. For instance, the International Court of Justice ruled that states have a duty to protect their citizens from from climate change, and also environmental issues should be front and center in governance. So civil society action is continuing. We are continuing to raise awareness about the impacts of climate change, as people can see through the warming of their societies, through extreme weather events. So that we do believe that civil society resistance on climate issues is continuing. It's strong, but we are in a moment where there have been some setbacks, but which means that our resolve is only strengthened to continue to push back against these issues. This year's report is also lays a lot of emphasis on migration. Arguably, the history of human civilization is the history of migration. For millennia, people have moved, cultures have evolved, cultures have mixed, peoples have mixed, languages have evolved, borders have changed. Yet, in the current moment, we are seeing a hardening of national borders, while larger states continue to ignore these and continue to attack the borders of smaller states, attack their sovereignty, while at the same time insist on the insolubility of their own borders. And that is a huge challenge. Our report, of course, does talk about, again, events in the United States and the impact that they are having in Europe, and also the mass surveillance and incarceration that's been carried out in the United States, and how there's been efforts to send people to countries like El Salvador, to Eswatini, to Rwanda and South Sudan by bypassing international law provisions. But we do see through civil society action, there's also been some positive moves. For example, in Spain, There's been efforts to regularize migrants to provide them a means to gainful employment and to be able to build a life. We have seen that in Thailand, migrants from Myanmar, there's been efforts to protect them, uh, uh, while at the same time, many states are putting in restrictive policies. So this is also an area where civil society is continuing to push back. We are also experiencing a profound moment of pushback against gender rights, against diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. There's been significant backlash against LGBTI groups from anti-rights movements against women's sexual and reproductive freedoms. And we have noticed that anti-rights forces have actually managed to ensure criminalization of same-sex relations in Burkina Faso and Trinidad and Tobago, while at the same time, we have seen civil society action being able to highlight the emergency on gender based violence in South Africa. In Denmark and Norway, we have seen an amendment of laws to expand abortion care for women. And we have also seen efforts on movement on marriage equality in countries like Liechtenstein and Thailand. So it remains a very highly contested space, but we are seeing that civil society action through litigation, through advocacy, through mobilization is continuing, despite the fact that there has been pushback on gender rights. And this means that our work on gender justice and gender equality remains ever more salient in this current moment. A key part of our report, as many of you would have noticed from the news, is around protests, about young people's protests. You can call them Gen Z protests, Generation Z protests. But there's a huge wave of new resistance that is rising around the world. Young people who are extremely upset with the way their governments are run, and for good reason, are taking to the streets, who are driven by impulses to ensure more peaceful, just, equal, and sustainable societies. So there's a huge wave of organizing that is happening. Of course, we saw protests in Nepal last year. We saw protests in Madagascar. We saw protests in Philippines. We saw protests against corruption in Bulgaria. So there are huge protests that are happening against entrenched corruption, against exclusion of people who may not have the same economic means as the elite. We have seen a remarkable resilience in Generation Z protests around the world, and we believe that this is the trend to watch, because young people are taking up their own agency. They are coming out onto the streets. They are shaping governance. Uh, they are speaking out for the issues that we in civil society care about, for human rights and social justice, despite the fact that they do continue to face systemic violence. A positive development that we noted in the report is the successful conclusion of a more or less peaceful election in Bangladesh, which was precipitated by protests which involves young people as well as larger swaths of society, and led to the a change of government in the country. So there is a lot of hope riding on Generation Z protests, and this is the hope that we want to carry forward, and the fact that there is resistance that is happening, even though at sometimes it might feel that the world is not in a good place at the moment. If we watch news cycles and we watch what's happening around us, and maybe see inequality, and as well as militarization, as well as increased government spending on defense and offense at the cost of providing social protection flows to people. But there is a huge wave of resistance that is rising. And in this situation, as we've pointed out, our report includes several examples of civil society victories. The story of civil society, the story of 2025 and 2026, is not just the story of repression, it's not just the story of strongmen, it's not just the story of conflicts, it's not just the story of attacks on civilians, it's also the story of civil society continuing to resist these negative trends, of not accepting the abnormal as normal, even as powerful forces want us to accept the bizarre as normal, even if powerful forces want us to uh, succumb to what they term as realism or pragmatism, that it's always been like this in the world. But we also believe that there are plenty of people fighting the good fight around the world who believe that a better, more just world is possible, and there are plenty of upstanding people who are standing up with courage, who are putting their lives and livelihoods on the line, uh, and are also winning victories. So our report does include several examples of civil society victories around the world while we remain in this state of flux at the moment. But thank you for the opportunity for sharing some of these reflections. I know we have a panel discussion after this, and we look forward to engaging with you on the report. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mandeep, for this very wholesome overview. I'll be passing now to Ines, who is the head of Civicus research team. She'll be facilitating the conversation between four panelists that we interviewed during this report's rising. So the Civicus research team is the team that is responsible for actually writing this state of civil society reports. Over to you, Ines.
Thank you, Nanya, and thanks, Mandeep. Thanks for a brilliant summary and great time management. Too much to say in too little time. So this overview frames this moment not as a collection of isolated crises, obviously, but as a true reconfiguration of power, right? We're seeing weakening multilateral institutions, rising militarism, the convergence between tech and political elites, democratic and human rights regression, shrinking civic space, you name it, right? Fortunately, all of it matched by determined resistance. So I'd like to explore both sides of that equation. On one side, the consolidation of an accountable power. On the other side, the strategies civil society is using to push back. And we are going to discuss this with four panelists who, as Nania said, all contributed to this report through interviews in which they analyzed an issue. They spoke about their experiences of activism. I will name them in alphabetical order by first name. So first is Bridget Moix. She is General Secretary of the Friends Committee on National Legislation, which is the oldest faith-based lobbying organization in the US, advocating for peace, justice, and environmental stewardship. And she's also the chair of the US Board of Peace Direct, not to confuse with the Board of Peace like Trump thing. Sorry about that. So the second panelist is Dikpal Khatri Shetty. He is the co-founder of Youth in Federal Discourse, which is a youth-led organization that advocates for democracy, civic engagement, and young people's empowerment in Nepal. Then we have Mohammed Nokim. He's a Rohingya youth human rights defender and director of international affairs of the Arakan Rohingya Society for Peace and Human Rights, and also the founder of Youth for Peace and Development. And last but not least, we have Nicole Van Rooyen. She is the executive director of Stop Killer Robots. This organization, Nicole is responsible for the overall strategic and operational management of the campaign, which, if you haven't heard of it, you're going to hear a lot about, killer robots and AI weapons. This campaign aims to establish new international law on autonomous weapon systems to ensure meaningful human control over the use of force. So let's jump into the conversation. I see all of the panelists. Yes, I see all of them. So let's start with the diagnosis and trying to understand what is happening in terms of shifting power. And the report. Let's start with Bridget. I'm gonna ask you a question just to frame the processes that we're seeing. The report highlights a shift from diplomacy and development towards militarization. including rising defense budgets at the expense of humanitarian and human rights and democracy aid. So you are in a special place right now. From your vantage point in Washington, D.C., how has that balance changed in practice? And what political forces are driving this change?
Thank you so much, Ines, and thank you to Civicus for this report and this webinar and all the work that you do. I just want to say first, as I sit in Washington, D.C., and this is a picture behind me of our office. It's right across from the Senate buildings on Capitol Hill. And I want to say how important the civil society connections globally are for us in the U.S. right now. And everything in the report that you spoke to obviously is related to what we are living through here and people are living through around the world in many ways. And someone put in the chat early on the elephant in the room being Trump and the Trump administration in the United States. And so I often want to come in and just start apologizing to anybody in the international community and global civil society for what is happening in my country. It is shocking. It is something we often say we never thought we would experience, that what is happening with our government right now. So it is more important than ever that we are making these connections and we are having these conversations and we are building these movements across the globe. And in terms of the forces underway and your question about the shift from diplomacy development to militarization, I mean, my analysis is we've gone from bad to very, very worse, to really extreme militarization, certainly coming from the Trump administration. Massive cuts in foreign assistance that have taken thousands of lives around the world and that have devastated communities that were done incredibly irresponsibly, incredibly recklessly. And then we are seeing this administration pour money and weapons into not only direct wars, but illegal, blatantly illegal kidnapping of other leaders in Venezuela, blatant illegal war in Iran, and targeting with Israel of leaders there. So it is a very, very dangerous time for our world. And unfortunately, I do think the Trump administration is a major driving force in that militarization. Just to share a quick story, we are connected with some of the folks who are connected with the negotiators in Oman who were trying to get a deal between the Trump administration and Iran before this war broke out. And they said, I understand that we were so close to a deal that would have been a much better deal for nuclear, non-proliferation between Iran and the U.S., a better deal than we even had before. The table was set in the negotiating room. They had bought pens, special pens to sign the deal. And the U.S. started bombing. The U.S. again walked away from a diplomacy and the opportunity for a diplomatic solution to pursue military options. So this is a very dangerous time. Everything the U.S. is doing to undermine international institutions that really uphold basic principles of democracy, of international law, is driving this further towards militarization. And then, of course, the war in Iran now is going to increase, and we're seeing it increase the desire for higher military budgets, for more weaponization, for even more nuclear weapons from other countries. So this is a very dangerous time, and I am also glad that we're going to talk about the rising movements to counter this as well. But I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Bridget. This clearly puts accountability or lack of it front and center. So let's move on to Nicole. We have a question regarding accountability for you, Nicole. The report describes this convergence between technological and military power, in which AI systems are increasingly embedded in weapons, right? And there is an issue here with accountability, right? Because when harm happens in operations that involve autonomous systems, who is responsible? The responsibility may be distributed across, programmers, contractors, commanders, political leaders. Does this diffusion of responsibility make democratic and legal accountability harder to enforce?
Thanks a lot, Ines. And also just want to echo what Bridget just said. Thanks a lot for the report and for inviting us to this important webinar. So indeed, for sub-killer robots, the accountability gap with autonomous weapon systems or decision support systems, which were widely used also in Gaza and are currently also being used in other contexts, like in Iran and Lebanon, and we're also used in Venezuela. These systems, yeah, they clearly also bring with them an accountability gap, and it's a serious concern. What we see is that with decision support systems and autonomous weapon systems is that the human control or human oversight is being eroded, and it makes it very harder to attribute responsibility in case of a breach of IHL or IHL violation. And so, and accountability is, of course, fundamental principle is a fundamental principle of international law, and it serves several purposes, namely to deter future violations of the law, to prevent impunity, to ensure compliance with the law, and for justice and reconciliation in the aftermath also of a conflict. And so part of the ongoing discussions within the framework of the UN Convention on Conventional Weapon, where discussions are ongoing on trying to regulate autonomous weapon systems, is also really much to see whether IHL applies or not to these systems, because they were meant, IHL was really meant for individuals and not for machines. But although some states don't want any regulation, I think the vast majority of countries have now, over 140 countries, have really expressed the need for regulation, and hopefully that also reduces the accountability gap that we see, and that is so important.
Thank you, Nicole. And yeah, that's a good start, right? And understanding there is a problem and trying to solve it. And we'll keep talking about accountability with Dikpal and Mohammed because well, we have some questions about what happens when people cannot get accountability in their own context, right? So, Dikpal, this is a question for you. When domestic institutions are ineffective or unresponsive, we are seeing, and that's something we documented in our report, young people mobilizing outside formal channels. So what, in your case, in Nepal, what created the tipping point for mobilization, and what do you think determines whether authorities respond with reform, with repression, or basically simply waiting it out?
Yeah, thanks, Ines. I think just to answer first, I think there are two parts in your question. So I'll just go with the first, where you mentioned about what was the tipping point. So I think that for us, the tipping point was, it was a accumulation of a lot of frustrations. The frustrations was building up in a young people where a lot of corruption cases were there, but it was not moving anywhere. The public services was weak, and there was a lot of issues of employment, and the public institutions, it felt like it was captured by their party networks, especially political parties and their cartels. And then what came in a spark, or what came in as a trigger, was the social media ban, and how Nepo baby trend was increasing, and that just facilitated all those frustration to be navigated, and then made us organized in a digital space. So that's how I think the accumulation of frustrations, and then the trigger point of how government acted, banning social media, curtailing our freedom of speech, and also rise of this with Nepo baby trends, and showing out the corruption cases. So that's what I think the tipping point that I would say for in Nepal. And then I think to deal with the second part of your question, I think it's how authorities respond either for reform, repression, or wearing it out. I think three different things controls it, I guess. First is what is the political cost of it for doing either three of it, and is the movement movement coherent? If the movement is not coherent, is not focused, then it's easy for government to uh, d- disperse and not care about. And also the narrative, like how strong is the narrative and how much it is backed by different groups. I think in Mandeep also mentioned in his report that there could be an instance where there could be a superficial agreement from the government, and just to disperse the narrative as well as the movement as well. So that happens. Um, and I think just to give one context, I think 3 or 4 months before the actual Gen Z protest, there was a teacher protest in Nepal. Teachers were demanding fair enough salary, good facilities, and also the infrastructure to study, and also the how they are promoted and everything. But the government waited it out for 2 months. uh, they just dragged it on, and then then the movement was fragmented. Then parents were questioning why they are doing that. Students are not getting study. So these kinds of, I think, disperse technique they would use, and I think as a movement we really need to be uh, conscious about those things and make our movement such that it should be, I think, as much as clear demands and well documented, and also get the solidarity from different networks like professional groups and local leaders, and even independent media as well. And I think if that synergy can happen, then it would be hard for the government to not listen to us.
Thank you, Dikpal. And I see we already have a few different tactics civil society is using to seek accountability, right? So advocacy and pushing for regulation, and then taking to the streets in protest. And we have a fourth tactic that we want to discuss with Mohammed, which is litigation, taking to the courts. Let's focus on the Rohingya case, which reached the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, which seems like a breakthrough at a time when so many accountability mechanisms are being weakened. And actually, for the record, there are two separate cases against Myanmar. One at the ICJ, seeking to hold the state responsible for violating the Genocide Convention, and another one at the ICC, the International Criminal Court, seeking to prosecute individual military leaders for specific crimes against humanity. So here's my question, Mohammed. From your perspective, does this suggest that international justice can still constrain power in meaningful ways, or does it demonstrate how dependent legal accountability is on political will?
Thank you for having me here. My name is Muhammad Nakims. So, when I watched the opening, the ICJ hearing this January, it was the first time I felt that the suffering of Rohingya was being heard in a space where the truth must matter. For decades, our pain was denied or treated as an internal issue. Suddenly, it was before the world judges could, with the evidence of burning village, mass killing, systematic persecutions that were presented. For the survivor, it is not only a legal milestone, but it is a form of recognition that what happened to us was not an accident. It was a history and a crimes that deserve a response. The ICJ cannot stop every atrocity, but it can draw a clear line. When judges say genocide acts are being examined, that Myanmar has obligation under the Genocide Convention, it sends a message to the military and to the political leader and to other government that the world is watching to us. We saw this already in the provisional measure that the court ordered earlier in 2020, which require Myanmar to prevent the genocidal acts and preserve the evidence. Even though the implementation was very weak, through this measure, civil society gives and is a tool to demand changes, to document everything that have been happening to the Rohingya people. If I say what will be the political will, at the same time, this can show the limit of the international law when the powerful states decide to protect each other. ICJ decisions do not enforce themselves. They rely on the government, on the bodies like UN Security Council, on the regional organization to follow through. This is where we see the lack of political will. For example, despite the coup order, Rohingya people in Myanmar are still suffering from different kind of violation, re-extraction, deprivation, and there is no meaningful move to restore our citizenship or dismantle the discrimination law. So we see clearly that law can expose the truth, but it cannot be by itself force the political changes.
Well, thank you so much, Mohammed. You're taking us straight into the next part of the conversation that we want to have, because definitely, I mean, what you're saying is something we are stressing a lot in the report, is that all these trends that we are looking at, they are not, abstract. They are actually affecting those with the least access to rights the hardest. So they have lived consequences for people, for real people. So let's start again. Like again, I have a question for you. Let's continue this conversation, and we have well, particularly in our research about migration and asylum seekers and so on, we have read and written a lot about statelessness and how it's often discussed in legal terms, but it has very real practical consequences for people. So we would like to know from your perspective, what does it mean for everyday life, education, work, mobility, political voice? How does living without citizenship shape a community's ability to organize and mobilize?
Yeah. Like statelessness sounds like a technical word, but for us, it's a everyday part of my life since I was born because it's controlled by someone else's permission. Without recognized citizenship, you cannot freely travel, you cannot vote, you cannot own a land, your existence depends on the document that authorized to cancel at any times. Let me share an example. In the IDP camps in Myanmar, where more than 100,000 people has been kept, this show of restriction of the movement because they have been put curfew, checkpoint, constraint fear of being accused of illegal movement just for visiting to another family to another township. It means young people growing up who have never been seen a world where they can walk without being stopped. This is something like every day we have been put of life. Let me say one of my story. When I was completed my matriculation examination, I wasn't able to go to the university just for being who we are. And then I decided to help to my community. I applied to the government job and other things. And every time they said you are not eligible for this job because of being who we are. It's the stillness is something that affects to everyone, especially to the Rohingya community since we are one.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. We'll continue talking about the impacts of these trends on people, on real people. And one of the trends that we are tracking in this report has to do with conflict and how civilians are increasingly not just affected, but actually targeted in conflicts. So here's a question for you, Nicole. Um, it's about conflict and autonomous weapons. So in settings where civilian protection mechanisms are and were already fragile, what does the introduction of autonomous systems mean for communities affected by conflict? Do these systems change anything, worsen the risks civilians face, or is there any way that they can seek redress for this?
Yeah, thanks, Ines. I think the proponents of AI and autonomous systems claims that these technologies will improve targeting efficiency, reduce human error, and limit civilian casualties. However, the reality is that integrating AI and large language models in the kill chain only increases the speed and the scale of the targets that they hit, and with that, mass amounts of civilian casualties, as we have seen in Ukraine, in Gaza, and as we're seeing in Iran today. If we look at Gaza, the death toll and the sheer level of destruction of civilian property and essential infrastructure raises serious questions as to how the principles of distinction, proportionality, precaution were respected by these systems. And for Iran, we know that the US has struck about 1,000 targets within the first 24 hours of the operation, which is also just scaling up the number of targets and in a very short time frame. And speaking to AI experts, we also know that large language models have about an accuracy rate of 25 or maximum 50%. So that's really quite low. And this means that there's a very high probability that most of the target strucks would be people or objects that were mistakes, right? And could be potential violations of international humanitarian law. And then secondly, just wanted to draw your attention also to the fact that because these autonomous weapon systems can identify, select, engage a target without a human operator knowing when or where the attack will take place, it inevitably also impedes much needed humanitarian efforts, right? And so such as evacuation of wounded or dead civilians from combat areas, the provision of basic necessity, and also urgent repairs in terms of critical infrastructure that would allow essential services such as hospital to continue functioning. And so this aggravates an already very, very dire situation because it's like having a drone flying above a certain area and you can't deactivate it. And so you never know when it's going to strike or who it's going to strike, right? So it really has a significant impact on the way the civilian population can seek refuge, can seek, shelter, safe place, but also in terms of supporting them and getting humanitarian aid is really very, very complicated. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Nicole. Well, that's really scary. I didn't know those were the numbers, and my question would be, I mean, they seem quite dumb to be based on AI, or are they just evil and it's by design that they are supposed to have? Well, it's not a question; it's a rhetorical question. But anyway, let's move on to Iqbal. Let's talk a little bit about the consequences of the repression of the movements for people on the ground, because we all the year and you'll see in the report we write about Gen Z at the end, and the purpose of that is just to leave readers with a note of hope, because we think that's what gives us hope, this mobilization of a young generation. But also beyond the celebration, sustaining these movements is hard, right? And also these protest movements have faced lots of repression. So what pressures are young activists facing on the ground, Iqbal?
Yeah, I think when you are asking just about repression, like I think my mind is just floating how Nicole was saying all about AI and how it is impacting, and I think one of the repressions and one of the uh, pressure that we face is also a surveillance. I think in AI community as well, the deals that was happening and the deals that was not did not happen, and the subsequent ban that followed also highlighted how surveillance could increase with AI and everything. And this is also a constant fear among the protester activists, like digital surveillance, like what are the travel restrictions are there, and even the threat to the family. And at the moment, it's just not about physical threats. It's also about digital intimidation, and everything also adds on to our mental health. So that's about how the repression is happening. And another issues that we are facing is the burnout. I think this constant need of like need to be present and need to be urgent, and also the feeling all the different harassment as well, online spaces as well. And also uh, there will be moments where you feel like nothing is changing and you are doing so much, like your body, you're like organizing so much, and okay, where is the change that you want to see? And I think that's just hits you out. And that's also like, I think, as organizers, I think that is really important thing to take note of. And the third one is, I think, this is also boils down to what is your person's interest versus the group interest in the movement as well. There is a like fear of co-optations, like some political parties might offer you the party tickets, run for the elections, or some of the uh, like support groups might give certain funds to some organization but not to the others. And that's how they split the groups and also dilute the overall demands of the movement also. And I think that is also one of the pressures that we have been facing as well. And I think one of the most underrated like pressure is the economic insecurity. Like as a young people, like you also have to live, right? You have to pay a rent. You have some, I think in a South Asian context, you have to also be at least be responsible for your family members, and I think pay for the tuition fees and everything. And I think that is also something that is always in your mind. Like you are living your life, but also you are living, wanting to make a change and wants to be in a movement as well. So I think that economic insecurity. So I think, as Mohammed also mentioned, that legal aid and everything also needs to be followed up with other ecosystem chains to really make a movement sustainable. I think the infrastructure has to be built, like legal aid, mental health support, even the security practices, and how uh, different peoples who don't want, always wants to be visible, but they can help them with research and also community organizing and give the back support in general. So have that community of people that gives those support without being actually in the front. So I think having a community, having a mental support, legal aid, I think that kind of infrastructure is also needed to all tackle all these pressures.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Dikpal. And I'm sure many of the things you're saying will resonate with Bridget because well, as she said at the beginning, the people in the US never thought they would in their lives they would have to go through this kind of high risk activism. So let me ask you, Bridget, about the decline in civic space, the respect for civic freedoms in the US, and about the decline in democracy. And it's maybe a difficult question because it's not just about what the consequences of these declines are on the ground in the US, but also what are the consequences for people in the rest of the world.
Yes, I was reflecting as I listened to Deepal that this is a time that we are thankfully realizing how interconnected we are, and how much actually our security and our safety is intertwined, and that people in the US have for a long time, many people, not everyone, thought we were exceptional in some way, and in fact we're not. So your experience, Dikpal, of that holding your daily life and holding how do we live in a movement under an authoritarian or abusive regime is what we are living in the US. We feel now. And I want to say that this year is the 250th anniversary of the U.S. becoming a country, the United States becoming a country, and our democracy has always been a struggle, and it has always been imperfect. Remember, my country was founded on genocide of indigenous peoples here. It was founded with slavery as fundamental to its economy. We have continued racism and abuse. Immigrants have always, the next wave of immigrants has been targeted, and had to fight for their rights. And so this is not new. in the United States. It is a continuation of the struggle for democracy, for making the principles of our democracy, which is what we hold on to, which is what we want to say that is what America is. It is the struggle for that vision that all people are equal and that we all have a voice and we all can participate in shaping the country and the world that we want to shape. So we are at an inflection point, though, a very, an unexpected inflection point now, and a lot of backsliding. And so we are struggling for how to sustain momentum in building a democracy and building, that beloved community. And in terms of the impacts on people, I would just say it is both here in the US and it is abroad. And so in our communities, we are watching our neighbors get picked up off the street, kidnapped, and sometimes flown to other countries, deported to other countries. There are communities here, immigrant communities, Black and brown communities who are too afraid to leave their houses. Many people have friends and family who are migrants, and they carry their passports, because U.S. passports, to have documentation that they're a U.S. citizen at all times. So these are the things, people are living with a sense of fear and uncertainty, and abuse, direct abuse. And so we've seen certainly people being killed by the enforced immigration campaign here. We've seen migrants killed. We've seen U.S. citizens killed in our streets. And there is a mobilization against that. And so there are people who are embracing more risk and standing up for their communities and working to protect each other and to push back. And we see examples in Minneapolis and other cities around the US of people doing incredible work to build those networks of protection and create that space where we can keep striving for our democracy. And we're seeing the impacts of US militarization abroad. So our campaign now is war is not the answer, at home or abroad, because the Trump administration's blatant impunity and corruption, and that is what we need to name, is harming people all around the world, whether through direct wars in the Middle East or Venezuela or elsewhere, or through the cutting of the foreign assistance that we mentioned before. And so these are real impacts that have real effects on people. And also, I think that we are discovering that we are part of a broader global movement for change that is rising up. And so I really appreciate that the report makes sure to emphasize that, and that is the work that we need to do. It's not about protecting any one democracy. It's about protecting the principles of democracy and civil society participation that we believe in for a better future.
Well, thank you for ending on that high note, because the resistance, I mean, that's the focus of the report, and it's what separates us from like depression and being frozen, not knowing what to do. So let's have a last round of questions about the resistance. How civil society is holding the line, what gives us hope, and so on. So let's start with Dikpal, because we've said. We left, Gen Z protests for the last chapter because we wanted to end on that, high note of hope. So let's talk about how youth-led movements operate, and we have noted, of course, that these movements often operate differently from established NGOs. More horizontal, more digital, less formal. So where do you see tensions between these models? What would you want established civil society to better understand about how young activists organize?
Yeah, I think I was just reflecting on what Bridget mentioned about the democracy and how they have like practicing since long, but still they have a challenge. And what is happening in Nepal is that in last 70 years, we have 7 different constitutions. Like literally per decade we are getting new constitution, and it's a cycle of instability. And I think uh, for as a young people, what's difference between the youth movement and the NGOs are like that. For They are also complementary to each other, but I think the tensions comes when I think youth movement are more like focused on like fast network, and also to put on the narrative on the front and then go for it, and then think about other consequences later on. And then but Whereas in NGO structure, you have to be structured, like you have to be compliance heavy, and also I think that's a reality as well. You need to be transparent and accountable as well, to I think maybe to funding agencies, to your partner organizations. So the compliance part remains there. uh, so I think when we see a tension, I think the different frameworks that needs to work is that they can work together as well. But what needs to be established is that uh, young activists like do not reject institutions, but they reject the gatekeeping. Like they want transparency as well. They want this set decision making, and also respect each other's legitimacy. In this case, what can be done is that NGO can provide a backbone support. Like they don't need to capture the agenda. Like they can provide the legal support, safety training, and as well as like some of the financial supports, and the access to policy space as well. Like they might have a network to good researchers, civic practitioners, and I think. That's how they like help the agenda, but not like capture the agenda to themselves. I think that's how the NGO versus movement narrative is being created. But I think I see like if the breeze can be there where agenda is carried by youth movement, and then the support system is built by the NGO with all the compliance in place. I think that's how we can balance it out.
Well, thank you. And you're pointing to in the direction of, some of the things that need to change in terms of how civil society operates. And so let's ask Mohammed also about other things that would need to change in terms of inclusion, international inclusion of displaced communities. We've seen international forums increasingly invite representatives of excluded groups, for instance, to testify in this international accountability processes, but maybe they are not as able to influence decisions, So what would meaningful inclusion actually look like? What needs to change?
Okay, thank you. I think today inclusion often mean inviting a survivor to share a 3-minute testimony at the beginning of a meeting and then leaving the real decision to diplomat and expert. It allows institution to say that they have listened the affected community, but there is no changing. This is how the power is distributed. For the Rohingya advocate, this can feel like we are asked to reopen our own again and again for someone else's agenda, without having any real say in what's happened after we speak. Meaningful inclusion starts with a decision making power, not just presence. That means our representatives sitting as equal member on the advisory bodies, negotiating teams, monitoring mechanisms that shape policies on repatriation, citizenship, accountability, and assistance. It also means providing the practical condition to the participation and documents as well. So one of the changes funding. Donors should commit to share a resource directly to the refugee-led organizations or civil society organization with flexible long-term support instead of routing almost everything with a large international. Without resources, it is impossible to build the research, advocacy, organizing infrastructure that need to sustain the voice for the civil society. Another changes is in governance. For example, any future repatriation or citizenship process for the Rohingya people should have a formal seats or either with the representative chosen by the community. It shouldn't be not by hand pick up for the state. Similarly, the international community should be accountable for the mechanism, should integrate the Rohingya advisor to their design, and but there is nothing have been occur yet. International civil society has a crucial role to play in making a peace and sharing the power. That means stepping back when the Rohingya advocates are present, co-designing the strategies rather than presenting us with a ready-made campaign, using access to reopen the door that speak rather than on behalf of us. When allies insist with no panel, no policy process, no high level meeting about our future legitimacy without the Rohingya, because we are the one who face all these things, we know what is the solution would be. So it would be like no with just witness that inclusion be like a standard or not in favor. So inclusion means to be present with the real actor, like the real survivor, because they are the one who have been facing all this for the decades.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mohammed. Yeah, that's very illuminating. Um, and Nicole, let's talk about influence and effective tactics. The Stop Killer Robots campaign has built coalitions to push for regulation of autonomous weapons. And so when powerful states resist regulation, what works? What does civil society do, and what needs to do more of or better, just to influence the outcomes?
Yeah, hard, difficult question. So I think it's really a combination of tactics. Our coalition is composed of about 270 organizations working in 70 countries or so, and we've collected signatures, we've done parliamentary pledges, we've engaged in multilateral fora within the UN, whether it's in Geneva or in New York. We've also done regional meetings in different continents, and we've engaged with tech companies. We're now engaging also more with the financial sector, just to raise awareness on what they are financing. So it's a different range of techniques, and it's also going from the very local level to regional levels to the more global multilateral forums. So I think we just need to be active in all spaces and continue hammering in the same message. What we see from previous disarmament campaigns is also that even though certain states won't adopt a treaty or won't sign it, there's still a norm that's being built, and so it creates sort of a standard by which, even though these certain states won't adhere to it or won't sign on to the treaty itself, they do actually adhere to the principles that are in this treaty. So that is gives us some hope, and also I feel like there's an acceleration in recent months also, from all the media attention to how these technologies are being used in terms of what Digbal was saying also in terms of the mass data collection, mass surveillance, and how this data is feeding systems to oppress us or to eventually target us through autonomous weapon systems. And so I think there's growing awareness of the risks that these systems pose, and also there's a growing movement from the people of Gaza to Ukraine to Minneapolis, as Bridget was mentioning, also in Iran. And so there is also a movement of solidarity, and that puts pressure on governments, and hopefully they then take corrective actions and put guardrails in place. So yeah, I think we need to keep the pressure on collectively and just hold people to account.
Oh, thank you, Nicole. And yeah, I'm going to ask Bridget also about how we keep the pressure on, because the report warns about against civil society retreating into what we name as safer and quieter roles in response to backlash, the funding collapse. So particularly in the current environment that in the US that's so polarized. How can civil society organizations remain principled and rights-based without becoming politically marginalized? What do we need to do? What do you need to do?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think we need a multitude of strategies and approaches, really. These are complex problems. And of course, the authoritarian playbook that we're seeing rolled out by our government here in the US has a multitude of ways of repressing. And so we have to be able to employ different approaches. I'll just say, the courts here are pushing back, particularly, local courts. And that is one way that we really need to uphold the rule of law. So we need to practice the rule of law and keep insisting that that we have a society based on rule of law and not rule by force. And so practicing and pushing back on the courts, we've signed on to a number of amicus brief cases, et cetera. So that's really important to keep doing. There's organizing of protest mobilizations. As you know, the No Kings protest will have another big one here at the end of March, and making our voices heard in that way and holding the space and for public voice, for that freedom to speak out is very important for us. And so that is an important way to do that. And those protests can bring people from a broader perspective of viewpoints than you might think. The No Kings protests here, there have been lots of people who say, I never thought I'd go to a protest. I'm not a social justice person, but what's happening in my country is so concerning to me, and I'm a patriot, and I bring my American flag. And so it is bringing people across different perspectives. And then the advocacy and the civic engagement that we have to do with our Congress, our work here at FCNL, Friends Committee on National Legislation, where I work, is with Congress and trying to get Congress to maintain its role as a co-equal branch of government that is responsive and accountable to the people. And so we do a lot of work advocating, including on things like making sure that there are humans involved and not AI involved in nuclear weapons decisions. That's actually a little win that we got in legislation this past year. And continuing to insist that our members of Congress represent their communities. And the way that we do advocacy also, I think, has to uphold our principles of seeking the dignity in everybody, of upholding the rights of all, and of listening to people that we disagree with. And there are new coalitions coming that are breaking down the polarization a little bit. The Iran war is deeply unpopular in this country. And so there are people who are Trump supporters that are saying this is not what we signed up for. In fact, Trump said he would not go to war. And so that there are some ways that we're beginning to reach across these divides in our country. And we have elections coming up. And of course, that's going to be a really critical time. But fundamentally, we also have a lot of long-term peace building and healing work to do in this country. And that work is going to have to be about listening to what the deep grievances are across many different types of people and finding long-term ways of rebuilding social cohesion in our country. So I think we have to be able to play different roles and to hold that tension between peace and justice, between being very clear about our values and also being able to listen and engage with people that may be coming from a different perspective, while upholding core principles of human rights and human dignity.
Well, thank you so much, Bridget, and thank you all. We don't have a lot of time left, and we have lots of questions from the audience. So we have consolidated those questions, and because we have 4 panelists, we are going to ask you 4 questions. I'm going to ask the 4 questions together. You just take note of which one you want to respond to, each of you. I mean, if you want to respond to the same question of somebody else, it's fine. And try to respond in like 2 minutes to one of these questions. So let me read the questions that we have. 1, what are the major challenges and opportunities that civil society is expected to face in the coming year? The second one is, how are organizations navigating new laws that restrict international funding or increase surveillance on CSOs? And then we have a couple more specific ones. One is, what practical steps can young professionals or students take to contribute meaningfully to strengthening civil society in their local communities? And the last one, what collective actions are most effective at preventing technology-facilitated gender-based violence in digital spaces? So, 4 questions. Who wants to begin?
Yeah, I think I can go. I think I saw that last question where local communities and also professionals and students can contribute. I think based on what I think, I'm also not that, yeah, like seasoned professional or a seasoned activists to actually go through it, but still through our like practices, what I can like conclude is that I think first of all, I think we really need to start local and be specific about it, because civil society does not always like means big movement. It can solve small concrete problems, which is like excluded from decision making process, which lacks the transparency. It can be as basic as like, how do you solve the drinking water crisis at your local levels? So forming a small groups and working on a real issues. And I think second is also think about building a skills as well. Like in organizing, a lot of skills is needed. Like what you need to develop is also like, how do you document things? What are your writing skills? Like uh, how much digitally literate are you, like your data safety type of thing, your digital security, and also community facilitation, and understanding of the policies and the laws as well. If you have that basic foundation of how to study laws and policies and also speak the language of the government, then it would help in your advocacy works. So this skills help like more than, and I think help in the protest as well as beyond protest as well. And third is, I think connect online, but also try to like make that online connections to the offline relationships as well. Like how do you network? Because in this modern era, I know like it's also about a lot of inclusivity as well. The people with access to technology, access to digital devices can have this experience, but what we also need to understand is that if you have the access to it, then try to make that online energy presence into the offline relationship as well and mobilize from that. So yeah, I think finally, if we can start locally, build the skills, and then translate that uh, either offline to online or online to offline, and build that trust and create that community. I think that's how I think we can, as a students or as a civil society actor, we can grow. Yeah.
Thank you, Dikpal. Yeah, that was a very, very comprehensive and instructive response. Who wants to come next?
I'm happy to jump in. I would just like to speak to the broad question of challenges and opportunities this year, because, and there will be many years, I think, in this transitional time that we're in the world. But I really do believe that we're at a moment in which we need to recapture the norms that ground the whole international system and rebuild systems. We need new international institutions to be imagined and then constructed where civil society and civilians have rights that are truly protected, have voice that is truly connected to power. I love Mohammed's point that it's not just about inclusion, but it's actually about giving power to a broader set of people. And I think Civicus that plays a really important role. I mean, this connecting of civil society and how do we lift up civil society's voice and power. I think that is our international institutions were not working all that well. And I think a huge gap was they just relied on state power. and they, not even balanced state power, but civil society didn't have the voice that we need to have in our own countries and then also in the international system. So I think we need to be visioning and taking action. And I just want to share the quote from Nelson Mandela that's been inspiring me this week. He said that action without vision is only passing time. Vision without action is merely daydreaming. But vision with action can change the world. So I think that's our opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, you are so far, both of you are giving us a lot of reasons for hope, which is great because the overview, the situation we describe is quite dark, but still there's reasons for hope. So thank you. And who's next?
I can go next. I would like to answer the first question, the challenges of the civil society. It's like a combination of political and digital and the environmental pressure. Because a central challenges is the continuing the civic space as the more government restricted in the freedom of associations, freedom of assembly, and freedom of expression. I think recently there was a report around 70% of the world population have been living in the close reparation. So rising populisms, polarization, and demographic backsliding are expected to reinforce this trend. It's often accompanied by the cut of public funding and tight regulations of the NGO. At the same time, climate change will increase demand on the civil society organization to support adaptation and resilience. Even as many of them have feels overwhelmed by the crisis and a struggle that have been happening right now around the world. And the second thing is the digital transformation is a quite challenges because the governments have been using as a powerful tool increasing to reduce the repressions such blocking surveillance, online harassment, sometimes to silence the dissent, which provoke the self-censorship, fragmentation, the withdrawal the activities if anyone says some things about the reality because this is something what we will face in the future next few years. Civil society organizations will always comfort the practical barrier to the global engagement, including the financial constraint and the hurdled digital access to the limit of the meaningful participation. But everything becomes collapse, and it seems like the civil society will be in the future technologically have been uh, disappear due to the current challenges. And I think this together, this meaningful civil society will need to adopt organization and technological while defending the basic civic freedom in an increasing constrained environment.
Thank you, Mohammed. And Nicole, you get the last word. It is a responsibility for closing this event.
So if I understood correctly, there was also a question related to youth and civil society. And I think that is just really, really important. In our coalition, we really have a dedicated youth network as well, because when it comes to technology and these new emerging technologies, I think the youth is far better placed to understand them, to understand their implications, to know them. So having their point of view and having them represented in all these different fora, whether it's at local, at regional, or at global multilateral forums, their voices really count because they're the ones who are shaping the future and hopefully make a better place of the mess that is currently the world. So yeah, I think they are they're needed more than ever. So I would welcome them to speak up and stand up for their rights also.
Well, thank you so much, and for ending on a high note. I think we have a message from our membership team just about the next steps in working with the report.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. I mean, you all will agree with me that it has been a very insightful conversation. So please, I just want to sincerely thank everybody for making out the time here to join us today. For our presenters, thank you so much for all the contributions you've given us. I mean, the conversation we've had today does not only show the level of work that has gone into this report, but I feel like it also highlights, opportunities and implication and gives different perspective to issues that we can move forward, if you all agree with me. And then the reason why we've had this pre-launch is, I mean, it directly ties to our responsibility as a membership alliance. We're always putting our members in the center of everything we do. And the turnout that we've seen today really shows our collective responsibility and commitment to building people power and also, ensuring the world is a better place. So I thank you all for it. So like we've said at the beginning, these reports will be officially launching tomorrow, and we will be sharing the media kit. So please, I call on each and every one of you to please help us share these reports to your community, your network, and adopt it into the work that you are doing. I'm going to bring this meeting to a close, but it's not a close that the conversation is over. We'll consistently be looking at opportunities to explore translating these issues and insights that these reports have highlighted into, actionable and, actionable plans, basically. So thank you very much. And feel free to always reach out to us at membership@civicus.org. I'm very sure that one of my colleagues have already dropped it on the chat. If you want to, share ideas, anything at all, reach out to us at membership@civicus.org. And to all my colleagues on this call, thank you so much for all the hard work, for all the efforts. We really appreciate it. And to our members, thank you so much. And having said all of this, permit me to bring this session to a close. Please do enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.